Alright, welcome to our lecture on some of the costs of and the barriers to economic development, and these slides are designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture. I am Ms. Gall and I'll be your lecturer for the day, and I did go ahead and make some small changes to these slides, just so you know, but let's go ahead and dig into the topic of the day. So we're going to start off, we're actually going to do things in a little bit of reverse order. We're going to talk about the barriers to economic development. And these really fall under four major categories. Okay, social conditions, foreign debt, disease, and then political conditions. So social conditions are things like high birth rates or low life expectancies, high infant child mortality rates, lack of access to health care, okay, lack of access to education, and in particular the issue of trafficking. And really what trafficking comes down to is when children and or their parents are told that they'll be provided a job in a more developed area, and in exchange oftentimes they pay the trafficker some kind of a fee for a placement fee, and once they get to that more developed area they're sold essentially into slavery. So they don't get the job like sewing clothes at the factory. Instead they are cleaning somebody's house. Okay, so they're doing domestic work, or they're forced into sex trafficking, which is probably easily the most well-known and the most popularized version of trafficking, but it's not the largest version, so that is important to remember. Okay, so those are just like some of the social issues that come up when we talk about trying to develop economically, right? So if you have a lot of children, of course, then you've got to try and pay for things like education. If you don't have a lot of health care, people aren't living as long, or they're suffering from chronic untreated illnesses, right? And so then they're not producing the extras that are necessary in order to allow some folks to go off and do the work that's involved in development, because everybody's just trying to feed themselves and take care of their families. Okay, then when we get into the idea of foreign debt, literally what this comes down to is in many countries they're spending a huge chunk of their GDP or of their government budget just paying interest and trying to pay down loans that were made, in some cases 50, 60 years ago. And the idea behind doing this is that they were given loans in order to transition from colonialism to a capitalist system, or from a communist to a capitalist system or socialist system. And so they called them structural adjustment loans, with the idea that essentially what these governments would do is adjust their structure to a more capitalist system, and they would engage in a more what's called neoliberal model. Neo means new, and liberal in this case is liberal in that classical sense, not the modern political sense. And neoliberalism is basically the idea that governments should not interfere in the markets, and whenever possible that any government intervention should be resisted. Okay, so it's the idea that they're going to these are basically they were originally designed to be bridge loans to help as countries are selling off state-owned assets, as they're helping set up private companies and things like that. Okay. Then we talk about disease, right? And people in the global economic periphery have really high rates of disease and a huge lack of access to adequate health care. And so there's a number of ways that we could address this, right? NGOs are huge. For instance, that's one of the big projects with the Gates Foundation, is to try and deal with some of the healthcare issues. And really some of it's really very simple. It's very small things to be done, right? And a lot of times, especially when we're talking about NGOs, what they're doing is they're trying to address what are called vector diseases. And vector diseases are those that are spread by one host to another by an intermediate host, or what's called a vector, right? And probably the easiest example of this, and arguably one of the most famous examples of this, is malaria. And malaria is spread from host to host through the bite of certain types of mosquitoes. Okay, so if a person is infected with malaria and then they're bitten by a mosquito, the mosquito sucks up their infected blood, the malaria parasite doesn't get digested, and the next time the mosquito goes to bite somebody, it injects a little bit of that parasite into that second person's bloodstream, and now somebody else is infected. Okay, and it's actually, malaria is very easy to combat. You can kill the vector, right? Kill off mosquitoes. You can try and prevent people from getting bitten. And that's where a lot of malaria efforts go, actually. It's just passing out things like bed nets to go around people's beds as they're sleeping to help prevent them from getting bitten by mosquitoes, right? Or teaching folks to do things like not have standing sources of water for mosquitoes to breed in. So a lot of these, it's not, for a lot of the stuff, it's not that it requires a lot of money per se per person, but when governments have no money because they're trying to repay some of those loans and things, then it becomes an insurmountable obstacle and a huge barrier to economic development, right? And a lot of our folks that are living on less than $1.25 a day, the hardcore poverty that the UN's now working very hard to try and address, or getting ready to start really trying to focus on. These are the types of things that need to happen to encourage that development, to allow those folks to move above and beyond. Okay. Probably, though, arguably, the biggest problem when we're talking about barriers to economic development is political corruption and instability. Right? So political instability is huge, because if a company can't rely on the government to provide certain basic services, or if it can't assume that rules made by this government will be followed by the next government, then people have a tendency not to open companies, and foreign companies have a tendency not to invest, right? Because it's just not worth it. There are other places where they can invest their money. They just don't have to worry about it. Okay, so this is a huge, huge problem, right? And along with that, what we see is a huge divide, particularly so in peripheral countries, that exists between the very wealthy and the poorest of the poor. Right, and the very wealthy in some of these countries compare to the very wealthy here in the United States. And then we've got the poorest of the poor living on that $1.25 a day. Right, so you can see how that could potentially create some problems, because we've got very different education levels, we've got very different expectations, but we've also got, many times, those super duper wealthy got the way they are because they were stealing from the government, and they were politically very corrupt. Okay. Core countries have established democracies for themselves by and large, but that doesn't happen overnight, and countries in the periphery and the semi-periphery have had a much harder time establishing and maintaining democracies, because it requires building up public trust, it requires building up public knowledge, right? And because of that, what it's done is it's created, especially in places where poverty is rampant, politicians tend to be corrupt. They misuse aid. They exacerbate the plight of the poor, because it becomes this mentality of kind of a winner takes all. You know, I got elected, I'm going to do for me and mine, and I'm not going to worry about everybody else because I don't know what's going to happen when I get thrown out. Okay. And as a result, especially in a lot of those low-income countries, what you see is these corrupt leaders become very, very entrenched. And so you get leaders that are able to stay in power for, 30, 40, 50 years or more. Okay, 50 years is kind of stretching, but, 20, 30, 40 years. And as they're doing this, they're building up not only a huge patronage system, so a large following, they're also building up huge baskets of wealth that they then are able to pass on to their heirs, and in the process they're perpetuating this cycle of poverty, because again, people can't trust the government, but we don't get outside investment, we don't get a formal economy because it's too hard to start a company, and or people are afraid of having to pay bribes, and so it really becomes a self-perpetuating system. When we talk about costs of economic development, then we can start to talk about how countries industrialize, right? And so there's a few ways that companies tend to do this, right? So they do export processing zones, which is really just, it's a place that offers favorable tax, regulatory, and trade arrangements specifically to foreign firms. So these are places where they manufacture things for foreign firms, and with the goal that they're going to export them, right? Great example of this is the maquiladora factories in Mexico along the U.S. border, right? That got its start as an export processing zone, and ultimately it leads to, in 1992, so right around the time I was your age, right? The United States, Mexico, Canada established the North American Free Trade Agreement, which prompts further industrialization of that border region, because what it does is it gets rid of a lot of those barriers to exporting from Mexico, and a lot of those barriers technically exporting from Canada, but really Mexico has probably been the biggest beneficiary of this, because so much of the market for Mexican exports is the United States or is Canada. Okay. Another great example of this type of specialized industrialization are the special economic zones of China. Most of them are right along the coast, right? In part, they tend to function as export processing zones. But they also have special rules, for instance, for homegrown factories. And so the idea is especially in China, that they're going to experiment a little bit with different regulatory regimes, and as they experiment, then they'll be able to figure out what works and what doesn't, and this is the way in which China has slowly but surely liberalized their economy without necessarily liberalizing their government. So, just to give you some idea, take a look at the map of the world here, right? Not surprising, well, yeah, kind of surprising, right? But not necessarily. No export processing zones, areas that are not well developed, or areas that have high conflict. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, right? These are areas that don't have export processing zones. Large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right? Large parts of industrialized Europe don't worry about export processing zones. Okay? They don't necessarily need them. And we've got a lot of kind of mid-level developing areas that have a few, right? 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and in some cases higher developed countries. And these are countries that have either reasonably stable governments or very stable governments, and they're trying to build up their export sector, right? Same thing with our light green countries, China, Mongolia. Let's see here. I think that's Colombia at the top of South America. I could be wrong though, so don't quote me on that. Right? These are countries that are working very hard to build up their export processing sector in order to build up their manufacturing economy and speed their way along this development train. And then you've got countries that are super duper liberal when we talk about their trade, right? The United States. Actually, I lied about Pakistan not having export processing zones. They apparently have quite a few. Right, so lots and lots of things to see when we're talking about global patterns. Other things we need to talk about when we talk about export, or talk about industrialization, we talk about agriculture, right? So agriculture in periphery countries is personal consumption or production for agricultural conglomerates. Conglomerate's a fancy word that means a big bunch of businesses that work together, right? Very little is produced for the local marketplace, and distribution systems are incredibly poorly organized. Okay? In the periphery, yields per unit area are low, and subsistence modes prevail. Families are constantly in debt. None of this should be surprising. It should be reviewed. Right? Desertification is often exaggerated because humans tend to destroy vegetation and erode soils through the overuse of lands for livestock, grazing, or crop production. And the area that's been hardest hit by this, unsurprisingly, is Africa, because the ecosystem there tends to be just very fragile. Okay, last slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about tourism, which is a lot of countries that seek to industrialize and modernize using tourism. It's arguably one of the biggest industries in the world, right? And the host country tends to make significant, substantial investment in this, developing parks, developing avenues and things like that, areas for tourists to go. A lot of the income from tourist revenues tends to get reinvested in that tourist industry, so in airports, cruise ports, other infrastructure, that kind of thing, right? Tourism does create local jobs, but tourism also, they're low paying. They don't have a lot of job security. It strains the fabric of local communities, and it kind of creates a cultural landscape that's a study in harsh contrast, right? Rich tourist areas, and then you've got the locals. So I'm just about out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and not summarize, But if you have questions, please feel free to come see me, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have during class. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.